Howdy folks, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday with the mighty Jingles, and we're on the final stretch of the KV2 diorama. After this, I just have to make the actual diorama base itself, but for today, it's the German captives and the Russian soldier escorting them. So these are going to be coming down the road ahead of the KV2, passing between the KV2 and the group of Russian infantry resting on the roadside next to it. I'm batch painting these guys much in the same way I did the resting Russian infantry, so I've primed them all with the airbrush, and now I'm slapping the base coat on. Starting with the skin tones. Again, I like to work from the lowest or the deepest areas of the model and then paint my way outwards. There's just less risk of getting paint where you don't want it if you do it the other way around. Now, I have a bit of a problem when it comes to painting German infantry, because I don't actually have the correct colours. Well, I kind of do and I kind of don't, but more on that in a moment. Vallejo do an excellent German field grey colour set that I have actually ordered but hasn't arrived yet because things are going a bit slow lately. So I'm going to have to improvise. But a possibly bigger problem, not necessarily a problem, actually this is probably going to make my life a lot easier, is that there wasn't really a standard colour for German World War II uniforms. And I'm not talking about the various different camouflage pattern smocks that the Waffen-SS wore. I mean just your basic field grey uniforms. Most of them weren't actually grey. What are you talking about, Jingles? It's right there in the name, field grey. Yeah, but it's field grey, and fields tend to be green, and field grey was actually more of a green colour than it was a grey colour, and even then it wasn't unusual to see German troops in the same units in different coloured field grey uniforms, because not everybody making uniforms for the German army were using the same dyes. I mean, they tried to, but even when they were using approximately the same colours, not all of the dyes were the same quality, so the uniforms tended to fade to a greater or lesser degree as time went by. So you could have a huge range of different colours that were all technically field grey. You may have seen in the movies, particularly movies made in the 60s and 70s, of hordes of German soldiers all wearing pristine grey uniforms, and the reason for that is because, well, Hollywood basically. Movie costumers would have large stocks of German uniforms, all made exactly the same way, with exactly the same dyes and exactly the same processes, and they would look after them because there was always another war movie coming along who wanted to rent a whole bunch of German uniforms. So, again, particularly in the 60s and 70s, German soldiers tended to wear these fairly identical grey uniforms, and that really wasn't the case in reality. So the fact that I don't actually have a paint that's specifically called field grey isn't really that much of an issue. As long as I've got plenty of greens and greys and maybe some blues, I can mix them all in. And whatever the finished result is, it's unlikely that anybody's going to be able to say, Jingles, that's not the right colour, because, well, which of these is the right colour? And the correct answer is all of them. And if I have to experiment with the colours that I do have, and I am going to have to experiment with the colours that I do have, and not all of the German soldiers in this kit end up looking exactly the same colour, doesn't matter, because that's entirely accurate as well. Incidentally, this kit is German Captives 1944 from a company called Masterbox. I believe they're a Ukrainian model company. And I do like the kit, but the quality control isn't as good as the mini-art kits that I've dealt with previously. The detail is fine. The poses of the individual soldiers is great, but they don't all fit together as well as you might like. In particular, this guy, I basically had to file most of his arse off and use some modelling putty to actually get his legs to fit the rest of his body, because the greatcoat that he's got slung over his shoulder just got in the way. So it was a bit of a pain in the arse, far more so for him than me, because now he doesn't have an arse. But the end result was definitely worth it. I would definitely buy from Masterbox again. I mean, this is a good set, notwithstanding certain issues with fitting. Just forewarned next time that it might be useful to have some modelling putty and a file handy. Of course, the odd one out in the pack is young Boris here, because as well as the 5 German captives, you also get the soldier assigned to escort them all to the Gulag, although hopefully Boris isn't going to have to march them all the way to Siberia. Maybe just as far as the next train station. That should do. Oh, actually, I just remembered that before I get on to making the diorama, there's a couple of Soviet road signs that I need to get stuck together as well, but I'm probably not going to do an entire video on them. Right now I'm just trying to apply some highlights to Boris's face, and this is something that I am notoriously bad at. But if I don't practice it, I ain't going to get any better at it. Anyway, back to those German uniforms. So I've got a number of different ways that I can apply shadows and highlights. I've base coated them all in a very dark shade of olive green. And I have 2 Citadel shade paints that are also dark green. We've got Coelia green shade and Athonian camo shade. And I'm going to try them both out on 2 different figures. The Coelia green shade is a dark green. They're both dark greens, but it's a much more rich and vibrant shade of green. And I'm not sure it's going to work, but that's why we're experimenting. Now there's a third way that I could add shadows and highlights, and it doesn't involve using a wash with a shade paint like this. And I'm going to be trying out this third technique on a separate figure, but for now we're going with the old tried and tested just slap a wash all over it technique. So that was the Coelia green shade, and this is the Athonian camo shade, and as the name would suggest, it's a much more military type dark green. It's a lot less vibrant, it's a lot more subdued. And I'm betting that this is going to provide the best results, but we're going to have to wait until they've dried before we can definitively say so one way or the other. While we're waiting for those 2 to dry, young Werner here has hurt his hand, so I need to paint up the sling and bandages around his arm. I'm not using white for this because I suspect that he hasn't been looked after too well, and any rags that we use to strap his arm up probably aren't the cleanest in the world, although I suspect that young Werner has been taking care of his bandages, so he has been washing them. So I'm painting them in Wraithbone rather than pure white, and I'll probably stick a wash over them as well just to dirty them up a little bit. Meanwhile, the shade paints have dried, and here they are. One on the left is the one in the Athonian camo shade. The one on the right, Coelia green shade. I think the one on the left's better, but I'm not really happy with either of them. We'll see how they look once I've applied the highlights. But first I'm going to try out my third technique, which doesn't involve using a wash at all. I'm going to be dry brushing. So I've got some Nurgling green here, as you can see. It's a very pale shade of green. I've loaded up a brush with the green paint, and then you basically wipe most of it off until there's almost nothing left, and then you just brush it over the figure. It's best to use a brush that's reserved specifically for dry brushing, because this technique tends to ruin brushes. And, well, as you can see, it's just leaving that Nurgling green over the raised areas. This is the first highlighting technique I ever learned back when I was a callow youth painting up my Wood Elf army in Warhammer Fantasy Battle many, many, many years ago. And the thing about dry brushing, well, it's good for doing large areas, but it tends to leave a kind of dusty, scrappy, faded kind of look. And since these are prisoners, and they probably haven't had fresh uniforms in a while, that's more or less exactly the look that I'm going for with these guys. So that's the dry brushing done, and I already think it looks a lot better than the other 2 figures that had washes applied. It's not done, of course. I still need to do some detailing and apply the shadows, but I am sufficiently happy with how the dry brushing turned out on the officer that I'm going to go back and see how dry brushing looks on the 2 figures that I applied the shade paints to. And it wasn't too bad. Now, because on those two figures I've already applied the shadows by use of the shade paint, and I've applied the highlights with the dry brushing, it's pretty much just a question of doing the detailing. So I'm using Citadel's Stormhost Silver, which is a very bright metallic layer paint, and just using that to pick out things like the buttons on the uniforms, the eagle on the breast pocket. Now this is a bit bright and shiny, so I'm going to have to apply a black wash just to these silver areas alone, just to take a little bit of the shine off and to add an area of contrast between the bright silver and the drab green uniform underneath it. Since I've got the Stormhost Silver out, I'm going to take this opportunity to do the same thing for the officer here. Now normally this is the sort of thing that I'd be doing last. And the reason I do it last is because my normal painting process is to prime, slap a base coat on, shade it with a wash, do the highlighting, and then pick out the detail work like this. But this figure hasn't had any shading done, and I've already applied the highlighting with the dry brushing. I'm not going to be applying a wash to this figure, which is my normal process. I'm actually going to try doing the shading manually on this figure. So I can go ahead and pick out the detailing, like his collar tabs, his shoulder boards, and his breast eagle and buttons with the Stormhost Silver, and it's perfectly safe because I'm not just going to be drenching the whole thing in a wash to do the shadows immediately afterwards and mess around with the colour tone of the details that I've just painted on. So, manual shading. Not something that I've ever tried to do before. Normally I just rely on washing the figure and then picking out the highlights. Today, with this officer, I'm doing it the other way around. Base coated him, applied the highlights first with the dry brushing, and now I'm using some of the old Skill in a Bottle, Citadel's Nuln Oil Shade Paint, to manually paint the shadows on instead of just putting a wash all over the figure, and also putting a bit of contrast around the shiny bits that I've just painted on with the detail work and the Stormhost Silver layer paint. So we're darkening all of the areas around the pockets, around the pleats and creases in the pockets, and any kind of creases in the uniform, particularly around the elbows on the jacket and around the knees and the lower legs. All of the areas where you can see rumples and creases in the uniform, all of the areas where there would naturally be shadows. Somebody said in the comments of a previous video, why do you have to replicate the highlights and the shadows? Why can't you just stand the model up and let the natural light provide the highlights and the shadows? And that's a good question, and the answer is very simple. The model isn't always in the same light. You move the model or the light changes, and that will change the way the model looks, and that's why you have to imitate and replicate reality by using paint to tell you where the shadows and the highlights are. Because there's a certain look that you're going for with the model, and you want the model to have that look regardless of what the current lighting situation might be. If all you've done is base coated a model and you haven't shaded or highlighted it, it's possible that you might be able to get it to look pretty good if you arrange it in a certain way, with various lights at the right angles, with the right warmth and intensity. But what you've actually done is created a problem for yourself, because in order for it to keep looking good, you have to rely on everybody looking at that model, observing it, under exactly the same lighting conditions and from exactly the same angle. And what are the realistic chances of that ever going to happen? So that's why we paint the shades and the highlights on, so that we can get it to look the way that we want it to look all the time, regardless of who is looking at it and under what lighting conditions. And here's the finished result. Didn't paint them all the same way. Two of them I applied washes to and then did highlighting, which is my normal painting method, but I was so happy with the results on the officer, where I dry brushed him first and then manually painted in the shadows and recesses, that it's probably worth using this technique more in the future. It certainly is more time consuming, but it's not like I'm painting an entire army of these things. So it's almost certainly worth taking that little bit more time and effort over them. Anyway, that's it. They're done. Off to the Gulag with you. Do not pass go. Do not collect 200 roubles. Hope you've enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.